carrying a Sheila Jeffrey sign at Dyke March is inappropriate? What? By FCM. As is often the case with misogynists and anti-feminists, the trans horde that took advantage of the inclusivity read, a trans woman helped organize the march, and woe be unto anyone who crosses men who demand access to women-only space in general, the inclusivity of New York City Dyke March, and others who weren't even there. Don't seem to have read a word of anything Sheila Jeffreys has actually written. If they had read her, how could it have been rationally said that Jeffreys, a pro-female, pro-lesbian writer, and her work had no place at a lesbian-centered event? Or perhaps they read a couple of words, saw something they didn't like, and threw away the rest? The rest being Sheila Jeffreys' entire life's work of pro-female, pro-lesbian, PIV-critical, radical feminist analysis which spans decades and examines women's lives from pre-World War I, a body of work from which modern women can draw many parallels, recognize obvious patterns in how women are oppressed by men over time, and call age-old bullshit when we see it. Oh, come on. Recognize obvious patterns in how women are oppressed by men over time, and call age-old bullshit when we see it, because we are never ever allowed to see it. Women's history is routinely erased, and this is a deliberate political strategy to keep women as ignorant of patriarchal context and as oppressed, and as complicit in our own oppression, as possible. For women around the world who are harmed and controlled via heteronormativity and subjected to female-specific reproductive harm via mandatory PIV, and that's all of us, radical feminist PIV critical analysis is crucial to our understanding of our oppression. Having unfettered access to the pro-female, pro-lesbian, and anti-heteronormative work of our foremothers is critical to our ability to take the work further. And the trans horde doesn't want women to see it, or read it, or know about it. This is deliberate and serves male interests well. It only serves men to erase PIV critical work, penis and vagina critical work. In fact, we might even ask ourselves if supporting and educating women about Sheila Jeffreys' work at a lesbian-centered event is inappropriate, where would it be appropriate? And the answer, of course, is that it's not appropriate anywhere. For those of us interested in honest, open discussion of women's plight and in analyses of our oppression and the sources of male power, this leaves us with no forum in which to do this. Again, this is deliberate. It looks as if women simply have to be willing to be inappropriate, but this is not as easy as it sounds, when patriarchal mores and informal social conventions that serve male interests are backed up with credible threats and acts of male violence. For those who haven't read her, or whose knowledge of Sheila Jeffreys' work is only second, third, or more hand, without further ado, below are excerpts from her book, A Spinster and Her Enemies. Commentary mine. We see in Spinster that women who eschewed sexual relationships with men, even if they weren't lesbians, were labeled as sexually frustrated man-haters, even though it was actually a hard-won option and was made possible by women's increasing economic opportunities that made mandatory heterosexual partnerships increasingly unnecessary, which was obviously a good thing for any woman who found PIV problematic. Here's a page from the book. When the plight of the middle-class spinster is written about in the history books, it is generally posed as the excruciating difficulty felt by women who were desperate for husbands. This is not an accurate picture. Numbers of spinsters, at least until after the First World War, made a positive choice not to marry. They made such a choice either because they regarded marriage as a form of humiliating slavery and dependence upon men, or because they wanted to pursue a career and fulfill their potential in such a way which would not have been allowed to them by husbands. Maria Gray and Emily Shirreff wrote in 1871, "A woman should be reminded that in marrying she gives up many advantages. Her independence is, of course, renounced by the very act that makes her another's. Her habits, pursuits, society, sometimes even friendships, must give way to his." Close quote. Florence Nightingale is one of these women who refused to marry. She comments that there were women who sacrificed marriage because they must sacrifice all their life if they accepted that. Behind his destiny, woman must annihilate herself, close quote. Judging by their own statements and the fuss made about them in the press and by anti-feminists, some feminists were choosing before the First World War not to have any sexual relations with men. No PIV, says FCM. They were taking this decision in protest against the form taken by male sexuality, the way that women were oppressed in their relationships with men, and because some of them believed that the position of all women could only be improved in a society where there was a large class of celibate women. It would be very difficult to judge the size of this revolt, or precisely what it meant to all the women involved. However, the fact that feminists and others considered the phenomenon to exist and were either very enthusiastic or hysterically alarmed about it is interesting and demands examination, even if the number of women involved was fairly small. Close quote. Back to FCM's article. And I bet they were all ugly and fat too, because those characteristics also render anything a feminist has to say patently false. So we are now on the road to separating spinsters from normal women. We also saw a deliberate campaign at the time to encourage good women to be enthusiastic about their participation in PIV with men. Gee, where have we heard that before? And not only were the spinsters not having PIV, they were further marginalized from real women who not only put up with it like they had in the past, but also began to like it, or, to pretend that they did. And here's a page from Sheila Jeffries' book again. Quote, "It will be an unspeakable," and she's quoting, Sheila Jeffries is quoting someone else, I think. "It will be an unspeakable catastrophe if our richly complex feminist movement, with its possibilities of power and joy, falls under the domination of sexually deficient and disappointed women, impervious to facts and logic and deeply ignorant about life." Close quote. And FCM underlines the phrase sexually deficient and disappointed, and she calls them, fun femmes. Sheila Jeffries says, "These comments fit into Brown's campaigns to get women to participate enthusiastically in sexual intercourse." FCM says, "Are enthusiastic concerns." Sheila Jeffries says, "Those women showing the greatest resistance meet with her strongest disapproval." Christabel Pankhurst also addressed the attacks on spinsters' thwarted instincts in reply to some men who said that women not mated with men suffered and became a problem because of their unsatisfied desires. She stated that unmarried women had lives of joy and interest. In reply to those who apparently said that women's ideas of chastity are the result of past subjection, she said that the subjection of women had therefore brought women one great gain, which was the mastery of self and sex, and women had no intention of giving that up. There were two fronts to the battle against the spinsters. One was to declare against all evidence to the contrary that spinsters suffered from thwarted desire, which turned them into vicious and destructive creatures. This was a good way to discredit and undermine the vast quantity of work which celibate women were then doing in the women's movement, much of it directly opposed to male sexual behavior. Another was to promote sex freedom. Close quote. Now here's FCM's article again. "Radfems is bitter and don't like sex. Check. Real women let their men let the world know how much they love PIV. And this sex-positive business is about as fresh and new as, well, pre-World War I. So what is this all about, really? And why did PIV positivism and its attendant celibate bashing and lesbian inferring pop up at the precise moment it did? Could it possibly be because some women were about to legitimately cast off PIV and therefore men for good? Looks like it. Sheila Jeffries says, "One correspondent, with great foresight, attributed the propounding of a new morality to the fact that men feared that when women got the vote, their sex freedom under the double standard might come to an end. The solution was to encourage women to something called sex freedom, however illusory, so that the single standard that came into being would be that which men wanted, and not the alarming vision being propounded by most feminists." Quote, "It is noteworthy how anxious men are to safeguard their incontinence in the coming age of the free woman. They are expecting trouble, as your columns show, and by paying heed to them, free woman will be leaving the frying pan for the fire." Close quote. And that's a quote from I'm not sure who, from somebody that Sheila Jeffries was studying. Sheila Jeffries says, "She was quite right. There was no question of an equal standard of sexual morality in a society in which the sexes were not equal. When it looked as if the feminists might carry out their threat to enforce chastity on men, a new code of sexual morality developed which ensured that men retained the advantage. Some feminists suggested that sex freedom gave man more advantages even than they had enjoyed under the double standard. There is no doubt that in any system of free enterprise, including a sexual one, those with the greatest material advantages benefit most from the system, and often at the expense of those who are not so advantaged. But in 1911, although they did not know it, the celibates were swimming against the tide." Close quote. FCM says, "And here, of course, It was but a hop, skip, and a jump to the creation of lesbian as a deviant sexual category. Yes, apparently that was the beginning of the end of PIV critical feminism, and it was instigated by male sexologists, and just at the right time, too. Issues of morality, sexual expression, and orientation splintered feminists into basically two camps. Care to name them? And dealt the death blow to any real, earth-shattering feminist work, erasing anything PIV critical, literally, from history, even the history of feminism. Sheila Jeffrey says, it cannot be assumed that those spinsters who were defending their right not to engage in sexual intercourse with men were sexually inactive. The attack on the spinster was integral to the attack on the lesbian. Whilst the spinster and women's friendships were respectable, the love between women could flourish in a variety of different forms. A new respectability was being created by the sex reformers, based upon a woman's enthusiastic participation in sexual intercourse in or out of marriage. New categories were being created based upon sexual contact. Instead of the married woman and the spinster, there were now the actively heterosexual woman and the lesbian. And FCM says spinster versus lesbian. FCM's article says, new categories based on sexual contact, and at exactly the same time that feminists were dissecting PIV, finding it problematic, and becoming socially and financially able to do without it, for probably the first time in history. Now, why would that be? Sheila Jeffries says, the importance of his description is that it classified as homosexual precisely those forms of behavior for which spinster feminists, the new women of the 1890s, were criticized by anti-feminists. In the 1890s, some women were trying to escape the effeminate stereotype of woman. These feminists were neatly slotted into a picture of lesbian women who were really pseudo-men. Using the accusation of lesbianism to subvert women's attempts at emancipation is a form of attack with which women involved in the contemporary wave of feminism are all too familiar. Using the accusation of lesbianism to subvert women's attempts at emancipation is a form of attack with which women involved in the contemporary wave of feminism are all too familiar. Ellis's Sexual Inversion was the first volume in his Studies in the Psychology of Sex. Contemporary male gay historians have seen him as performing a service to male homosexuals by breaking down the stereotype that they were effeminate. For women, the service he performed was quite the reverse. FCM says, what a coincidence, and the sex-positive sexology was and is also lesbophobic and regressive. Not at all the progressive discourse we have been and are being led to believe by those who subscribe to it. And it's exactly as fresh as this lace tea gown, which I found here, circa 1890 to 1892. It could have been worn by the first sex-positive feminists. Now that's a good history, and I clicked on the link, but I couldn't find the picture. Well, I can just imagine. Read a summary of the events that took place at Dyke March here, and she gives a link for more about the sign controversy. See here and here. A version of this post was previously published at Feminade. 21 comments. Bug Brennan says, reblogged this on, you think I just don't understand, but I don't believe you. FCM says, I shall now erase all of Sheila Jeffries. It's a meme of Harry Potter waving his wand, and it says on top, I shall now erase all of Sheila Jeffries' pro-female, pro-lesbian, PIV critical work from the face of the earth, and on the bottom it says, and replace it with some trans-related shit she never even said. It's my right as a man to erase women's work. Don't you oppress me. Yisheng Kingwa says, ha, love the penned-in notes and stuff. Great. That Harry Potter meme thing is spot on, too. Karmarad says, well said. The quotes from Professor Jeffries' book are enlightening. I was impressed enough to look up Professor Jeffries. She's a professor of political science at Melbourne University with many scholarly books to her credit, and evidently one of the most prominent lesbian feminist theorists and historians in the world. Her objections to trans-activist theory that I have read are well-reasoned and not emotion-based, unlike the responses of her detractors. The calls of some trans-activists to silence anyone who promotes her work, in all its important aspects, in connection with a march to promote lesbian points of view, are only going to make her work more influential as more people read her books to find out what the brouhaha is all about. Loretta Kemsley says, the reason they are attacking her writings is because they're so effective. The more they can discredit every woman who resists their perceived male privileges, the more power and control they can continue to exert. Lesbians and hetero PIV-free women are a problem for all patriarchs, as you noted. They know women are rebelling against their dominance and violence on an international basis. The more power women gain, the more frightened and violent they will become. We need to be prepared for that reality. The Bewilderness says, it seems like it is one of those can't see the forest for the trees kind of thing. The entire history of patriarchy boils down to various ways to force or cajole women into risking their lives by having PIV. It isn't as though women didn't know it would quite likely kill them. They saw the evidence of it all around them, even if they were not allowed to speak of it. Read between the effing lines of Austin, and there it is. Every time a political change is made that makes it possible for any class of women not to marry, to be independent, a combined effort to demonize independent women and romanticize PIV is undertaken. It is there in the histories if people are willing to look and recognize what they see. It is in every bloody magazine on the effing newsstands. The greatest crime against patriarchal societies for women to point out this reality. Sorry, kind of off topic, but demonizing Jeffries and any other woman who addresses what she does is essential to the maintenance of male dominance in society. Not off topic at all, TBW. Thank you for that. Jeffries points out how the PIV critical work of early feminists was pushed aside and replaced by PIV positive rhetoric. It was anti-feminist backlash, in other words. The fact that the PIV positive crowd thinks they are being so fresh and progressive with their tired, ancient, enthusiastic consent bullshit, when it's really just more of the same, a play it again Sam scenario, is a painful irony and a pattern that we are obviously doomed to repeat. Pushing and spinning anti-feminist backlash and PIV propaganda as feminist and progressive is not new, but everyone who is seeing it for the first time would tend to get that impression. So they make sure it is the first time anyone is ever seeing it by erasing the proof that it happened before and erasing the radical feminist who called bullshit on it the last time around and the times before that. This is deliberate. M. Andrea says, from the second JPEG picture, quote, there were two fronts to the battle against spinsters. One was to declare against all the evidence to the contrary that spinsters suffered from thwarted desires. Another was to promote sex freedom, close quote. So the idea that women should be free to enjoy sex with men came about because the male supremacists of that time period noticed that women were becoming too uppity, too independent, and away from male control. Before that time period, women had no choice but to marry men and serve men, so there was no reason for male supremacists to propagandize the joys of sex with men. That was an extremely critical point for the fun femmes to get. They are doing the work of male supremacists while pretending that's progress. And now they're actively trying to erase the critiques of a male supremacist culture from even feminist spaces. With friends like that, who needs enemies? Seriously, fun femmes are patriarchy, and now I object to even the term fun femme because it's completely false. Libfem is the same problem. They're the exact opposite of feminist. Lucky Nickel says, I agree, Amandria, libfem is false terminology. These women are handmaidens and tools of the patriarchy and not feminist in the least. Some of patriarchy's best shields and foot soldiers are women, even though they're not the ones who primarily benefit from it. It's Stockholm Syndrome at its finest. Mary Daly had another word or two for such women. Token torturers or henchwomen, which is why simply being a woman doesn't qualify one to be a feminist. FCM says, seriously, speaking of, the video of the Dyke March confrontation has been released, showing one such handmaiden nearly coming to blows with, read, attacking, a lesbian in the handmaiden's zeal to defend the horde of poor defenseless male-bodied persons surrounding the lesbian and threatening her. It's really something to see. And it's, not able to watch the video, sorry. A Walk in the Park from Kathy Brennan on Vimeo. Femme Forever says, I so agree with M. Andrea and Lucky Nickel. I was thinking of all the times I've been in situations when a little verbal backup would have really helped me a lot, and every time I thought a woman would speak to my aid. And not once has that ever ended in my favor. Not once. In fact, I'm in such a situation right now, and in trying to get advice on how to handle a misogynist bully in a public small group environment, women keep asking, will anyone else in the group back you? Even though the group is 90% female, I have near certainty that I will be on my own when I mount my, I don't know what kind of defense in just a few days, and can probably count on having to defend myself from female attack as well. Lucky Nickel says, ugh, I saw the video. All I can say is CB's Kathy Brennan's a better person than I am because I'm not as polite to dudes who violate my space and get up in my face. It's an act of aggression and meant to intimidate, with an implied threat of violence. He's a lesbian? Yeah, right, and I'm the Pope. FCM says, holy shit, Lucky's the Pope? Cherry Blossom Life says that young woman is going to be kicking herself in a few years' time. The young trans woman, trans man, also made a complete fool of himself because while the trans language he was using, cis, etc., might have some semblance of coherency when used online, and if you suspend reality, we saw in that video that when it comes to real life, it simply doesn't work. So when Kathy Brennan declared that trans women weren't female, there wasn't much he could say to refute that statement except some garbled gobbledygook about identity or, did you misgender me? And LOL, Karma Rad. I was impressed enough to look up Professor Jeffries. Why, I think I might look her up too. Her work does seem well researched and well argued. And another thing, here in Japan, you wouldn't get away with speaking to a woman who is older than you like that. There's the age hierarchy thing going on here. So I want to say that to trans women in the video. Respect your elders, you little twerp. Carmarad says, hey Cherry, yes, of course I read chapters of Sheila Jeffries and heard her name many times, but I didn't actually know she was a tenured professor in Australia. I'm kind of embarrassed not to realize her prominence.